Today we're conducting a hearing on H.R. 3039, Welcoming Business Travelers and Tourists to America Act. The legislation raised important issues, including how we balance our nation's security and counterterrorism efforts with our desire to encourage increased tourism and more visitors from foreign countries. H.R. 3039 requires the Secretary of State to process visas for Chinese, Indian, and Brazilians within 12 days. The bill also requires the Secretary to conduct a pilot program using video conferencing to interview visa applicants. Supporters believe video conferencing should be used in remote areas far from a U.S. consulate office. The bill also allows the Secretary to increase the period of visa validity for individuals from a certain country, regardless of the reciprocal visa validity period for Americans traveling to that country. Our first witness today is Janice Kephart, the Director of National Security Policy at the Center for Immigration Studies. She previously served as counsel to the 9/11 Commission. Ms. Kephart received her JD from Villanova Law School and her bachelor's degree from Duke University. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation to testify and your continued interest in visa security. The bill we are considering today mimics President Obama's visa waiver interview pilot program announced in January 2012 for China, India, and Brazil. The effect of the President's program is still unknown in terms of reducing application processing times. If the pilot achieves the aims the President seeks, that is, to dramatically reduce visa processing times by negating many visa interviews and visa revetting, then this bill is unfortunately unnecessary, untimely, and premature. Especially concerning is that this bill probably unknowingly supports the President's amnesty policies that include not enforcing immigration law against the illegal population, but for convicted criminals and terrorists. What does systematic enforcement of immigration law have to do with this bill? Well, crunching out more tourist visas will add to more tourists likely becoming overstays. According to 2011 GAO reporting, ICE only actively pursues 3% of the overstay population due to resource constraints. None other than criminals and terrorists are pursued now, and even the criminal deportation numbers are half of what they were in 2010, with a paltry 5,500 identified in the first quarter of 2012, with twice that many identified in the same quarter in 2010. And what does this mean for Chinese, Brazilian, and Indian illegal population numbers? To me, this means they will grow. For years, Brazilians and Indians have come to the United States for many reasons, but also to get away from poverty, while Chinese often come to escape a repressive regime. That's good, right? This is America. We welcome people here for a better life. But unfortunately, that's not the end of this story. China openly commits significant corporate, government, and university espionage on American soil, and it uses its own citizens to do it. Just as disturbing are the incredibly high illegal alien population numbers from China, India, and Brazil currently in the U.S. These three countries have increased their illegal status in the U.S. by nearly 70% collectively in the last decade, with 700,000 illegal aliens in the U.S., representing 6% of the total 11.5 million of the illegal population. China is the biggest producer of illegal aliens outside this hemisphere, ranking 5th of 180 nations in the world. India ranks 7th. Brazil is close behind. And here's the clincher. Most of these illegals must be overstayed from issued visas. As to those arguing that there is sufficient security in the automated check state now does of visa applicants, and 12 days is sufficient time to vet all applicants, let me say this. First, few, if any, of the problems in visa issuance with the 9/11 hijackers had anything to do with technology or databases vetting the applicants. Rather, the issue was that the interviews that could have detected fraud and lies were simply not done. In the one instance where there was an extensive interview at a border security inspection at Orlando International Airport, potential Flight 93 hijacker Mohammed Al-Qahtani was forced to return to Saudi Arabia only because his interview was done. Second, fraud does not change depending on where a person is from or what the intent is in coming to the United States. Fraud is fraud, whether used by a terrorist, spy, criminal, or simple economic migrant, whether committed in 2000 or the year 2012. The commonality is that it all breaks the law. It's all detectable, but usually only through the interview process. Third, State's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Consular Affairs, Ed Romatowski, reiterated this point in a September 2011 hearing before House Homeland, making clear that the automated security checks and review of submitted documents don't catch what an interview will, saying, quote, "The personal interview that our officers conduct in our embassies and consulates often note discrepancies in the interview that open a line of inquiry and lead to a visa denial when necessary." Fourth, it's also important to revet visas, a case made manifestly clear by the facts of the Christmas Day bombers' visa issuance, and which is reduced in this bill. And lastly, terrorist organizations or governments seeking to use their citizens as spies are likely to recruit from those that have already been issued U.S. visas. It's foolish to assume that vetted once means no revetting need take place. In regard to video conferencing, there are a host of security issues that are specific to a visa interview, including State Department personnel safety, that I note in my written testimony that are not addressed in the bill fully. In regard to Section 7 of the bill, it gives limitless authority to the Secretary on what can be done to visa categories or visa terms with any country under any circumstances, very dangerous for immigration policy and diplomacy and our national security. In conclusion, illegal activity needs to be curtailed significantly and current immigration law enforced before we consider broadening out our visa policies even further than already done by the President, as this bill would do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kephart. Very briefly, Ms. Kephart, would you be kind enough to respond to, as the counsel on the 9/11 Commission, you may or may not have had a little different perception as to the statement that Mr. Alden presented. Could you respond to that?
Sure. I was my counsel on the 9/11 Commission assigned to the border team. I did all the immigration work for the 9/11 Commission for how the hijackers got in and stayed in. And I also conducted all the interviews of all the border inspectors who had let the hijackers in as well. So I come at this from a perspective, having been also an author of the 9/11 and Terrorist Travel Monograph, with a very, very strong sense of what our border recommendations were and why we insisted on the in-person interview. I was also the one who found out and discovered Mohammed al-Qahtani as the potential 20th hijacker who did not get in. It was based on the behavioral interview that was done of him at Orlando International Airport in August of 2001 that our commissioners decided to include the paragraph in the 9/11 Commission final report in the recommendations about the importance of the interview and the importance of determining behavior. It was critical to us. And so I do take a little bit of an issue at the interpretation of the 9/11 Commission report. Thank you for letting me respond.
Thank you, Ms. Kephart. Any interest?
And the question is, when one applies for a visa,
Yeah.
one can do so online.
Yes.
And then schedule the interview online.
Yes.
And if the interview time, according to the State Department now in most of these cities, is 2 to 4 days, then when one then schedules the interview within, say, 48 hours or perhaps more, when they arrive for that interview, the in-person interview that you've advocated, do they receive the visa normally at that meeting?
Well, according to the information that you've provided, I don't know if they're providing it at the meeting or at the actual meeting itself. My memory of it was that it was not always at the meeting. Sometimes there was a few days lag time. But if you're talking about 2 to 4 days, that is not a big deal, especially when you need to revet. When you have an issue, if you have an officer in front of you and that officer begins to note fraud in your interview, they're going to want to check out more. That is why you need more time. Sometimes you can't do that within 2 to 4 days. Sometimes you can't even do it within 12 days if it looks like you have a large fraud scheme in front of you.
Thank you, Ms. Kephart.